it's the last weekend in June. We've got the 4th of July coming up, but we also have an anniversary to celebrate today, the 100th anniversary of the Versailles Treaty, which was kind of a turning point in history. And Jane's going to bring us up to date on it as to what it means and why.
Good morning.
Hi.
Well, I'm not sure whether we should really celebrate this treaty or feel sad about it, because it did not bring great things in its wake. But let's look into it somewhat. In the first place, it's not just one treaty. It covers 5 or 6 treaties.
Oh.
Because the enemy consisted of course, Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which consisted of several different parts, of course, Austria and Hungary, and then other ethnic groups. But the treaty, what we call the Treaty of Versailles, was with Germany, and it was on the 28th of June in 1919. The treaty with Austria had been separated from Hungary, which Austria, more or less the Germanic parts. That treaty was called the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and all these these additional treaties were sections of Paris, in and near Paris. So Versailles, of course, on the outskirts of Paris. This one, Saint-Germain, and then we had a treaty with Hungary separately, and that treaty was called a Trianon, and I think that was held in the little Trianon, which is near Versailles. And then Bulgaria had a separate treaty of Neuilly, a part of Paris. And Turkey, the remnants of the old Ottoman Empire had still been there. And the treaty with Turkey, and these came along 1920 and even 21, a little later from the 1919 ones. But the Treaty of Turkey then was a Treaty of Sèvres, and I think that's the same name as the famous China, the famous pottery maker, China maker, elegant services and things. The treaties were held, the treaty with Germany, the Treaty of Versailles per se, was held in the Palace of Versailles. And let's please see a picture of this Palace of Versailles. And the Hall of Mirrors. And this, of course, is a very, very elaborate thing built under the old kings some centuries before. And it so happened that this is a very spot where in 1871, the Germans settled the war, the Franco-Prussian War, and took away a bunch of territory between France and Germany that had been bouncing around for hundreds of years, each side considering it their own, and in the middle, these people, kind of double people, 2 mother languages and so on going there. But that's where it was held. The actual date, the 28th of June for that one, followed some negotiations that went on for, probably since the end of the war, which occurred in November 1918. Now, actually, the Germans had come to Woodrow Wilson at that time and wanted to make peace. And that's when Wilson got busy, Woodrow Wilson, and he drew up his 14 points that he thought should be in the settlement. Let us look now at the next picture, please. This picture is Gustav Bauer. And the minute the war ended and the fighting stopped, almost right away, the Weimar Republic was established. It was to be a democratic republic, which was something that Germans really weren't used to. But the Chancellor of Germany, the first one, was a man named Scheidemann. And when Scheidemann got his first look at what was proposed in this draft of the treaty, he was horrified, because Woodrow Wilson had made his 14 points, everybody know, and these were strictly going to be fair and not terribly harsh. And of course, fair depended on who was calling the shots, who was defining what it is. That was one of its chief problems. But Bauer, at any rate, had become briefly the Chancellor of Germany, and he got one look at it and was just simply horrified. And he said, I can't sign this. Or Scheidemann resigned, and Bauer came on. And this Bauer that we've just looked at the picture of here, let's see him once more, was faced with either signing this treaty and just a massive resistance in Germany to it, or trying to get around it. Well, he did try to negotiate somewhat, and it didn't work. They said, we will just move over the border and occupy you, which was what happened in World War II. Right. They moved over the border and occupied Germany, so this won't happen again. But he did then finally send a delegation to Versailles. And only 2 people signed it for the German side. Imagine all these allies. We'll go into them in a moment. On the other side, drumming it up and arguing with each other and horse trading. But the next picture shows this man named Jonathan Bell. And he looks like, and he was, a middle-aged German civil servant. He was the one who was sent over, he and one other person, to sign this treaty. And again, they took a look at it, and they were totally in dismay, because the treaty was a very harsh one. We can go into those terms perhaps in a little bit more, but he did sign it, and they began really trying to implement it. Now, the next picture will show us, this is Georges Clemenceau. He was the French Prime Minister, and the French had a long history of resenting the Germans and being angry and keep tugging and pulling at this territory that lay between them, that they both wanted and they both considered their own. Clemenceau was not very forgiving, loving and forgiving feeling. The next picture will show us David Lloyd George. This was the Englishman in the big four, the big group at the top. The British were a little more willing to be a little more generous, a little less harsh. Their territory hadn't been chewed up the way France had, and Belgium. But they were more interested in the financial side, and the reparations that were going to be leveled were killing. The next of the participants this is Vittorio Orlando, who was the Italian prime minister, or foreign minister, I guess. Italy had entered the war a little bit late. We had, of course, not entered till it was well underway. But Italy had, on the southern front, they had some action with the Austro-Hungarian side, and they had it generally stood by. I think they provided some aircraft. Wasn't very good, but they did. He sat in on the things. Italy was hoping to get a little territory back as well from the deal. Now the next picture shows us Woodrow Wilson. And of course, we all know he represented the United States. The irony of a lot of this is that the United States never signed the treaty. We had a separate ending of the war. I think it was 1921, sometime in 21. But we did not sign that treaty. And it was largely because the Senate would not approve, advise, and consent. And we're going to look presently at some of the political cartoons of the day, which show you a lot about what was going on. Well, Wilson, the main word I think that he was aiming for was peace. He wanted to set something up that would ensure peace forever and ever. The League of Nations was the eventual outcome. We never joined either. The Senate would not approve that. And even later on, in the next political administration, right in the midst of all this, in 1920, we had an election, and of course Wilson was no longer, Wilson was not in good health. He had a stroke. He had tried very hard to get this country, to get the Senate to approve of our joining and working along with it. And he drew up 14 points. And these 14 points were another aspect of the situation, because in the first place they were not really vague, but they were very hopeful. They were idealistic. And there was no way without, there was no arbitrator on the planet who was truly neutral. So that was some difficulty there. But he said of the 14 points, and the 14 points, he mentioned them to the Senate, or the gist of them, in January of 1919, so already 5 months before the eventual treaty was drawn up, finalized. But this is what the Germans had in mind when they came to him, behind the scenes. And behind the scenes operating was something also he was very much against. But what else could you do? You're not going to dicker with the whole world looking on, right, and all the factions in your own country chipping away at you. But when they came to him and said, please try to broker at least an armistice, and then go ahead. That's what they had in mind. So it was really a shock. The people at Versailles, delegations, and there were many smaller ones because of other allies. I mean, Japan was an ally, Romania was an ally, and so on. They were all in on it, but not to the extent of the others. But when they were setting these things up, there was nobody there from the other side, not a one. No German, no Bulgarian, no Turk, none of those. So they finished their work, and then they summoned from Germany. They got in touch with the Chancellor of the new Weimar Republic, and they said, now it's all ready, come and get it, or come and see it. So Scheidemann was the first of the chancellors, and he took one look at it, and he said, this is totally impossible. The reparations were to be 6.6 billion British pounds. And I looked up what the British pound was worth in those days in terms of a dollar. $1, or 1 pound sterling in those days was worth $2,500. So if you multiply 2,500 by 6.6 billion, you get an awfully large number, more than the annual budget of most countries. So he took one look at that, and of course there were to be reparations, and there was a clause, famous clause, infamous clause, 231, which was the War Guilt Clause. And it said, Germany assumes total and complete responsibility for all of this. Now, you can prove the Germans were responsible for starting that war, unquestionably. But when you compare it with the way, for example, World War II was handled, and General Marshall was the prime mover there, he said, what good will it do us to just start another war by really cracking down on them? The Treasury, Morgenthau, they all wanted to just really almost obliterate Germany, not give them any chance to make a living or get back on their feet. Well, that's what the deal was to be there. And you could just see it would have been totally impossible for a country that was flattened to do anything about it. But Woodrow Wilson was more interested, of course, he said, for instance, Belgium should be evacuated and rebuilt. We have to do that. And of course, Clause 231, Germany has to pay for it. You can just see what was developing at that point. So Scheidemann said, I can't sign this. And he went home, and he was replaced by Bauer, whose picture we looked at. Bauer looked at the situation, he said, we can't do this. And he tried to dicker. He said, let's wipe out that thing, because every man, woman, child in Germany shouldn't we have to pay for this so terribly? Well, tried to dicker, and that didn't work. The Allies simply said, no, you either accept this treaty, sign this treaty, or we invade, and Germany essentially will cease to exist, at least for a while. Well, that wasn't going to wash either. And then, of course, when the United States wouldn't sign it, there went another possible breaking influence on some of the difficulties. It was designed really to start another war. Immediately after the treaty was signed, the chancellor, there was a turnover of chancellors in Germany, but none of them lasted very long. And the chancellor was named Wirth, Karl Wirth. And he got in touch with the chief of police, so to speak, with the army chief general. Germany was to be allowed to have 100,000 troops, which were just essentially a police force. But they were allowed to have an army, but it was just this 100,000. They were allowed to have a navy, but they could have 6 of the 3 main kinds of ships. They had 6 battleships, 6 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and a bunch of PT boats to fire them off. There they were then. All I'd have, only this, no developing of any kind, no Air Force, nothing like that. So immediately, and again, behind the scenes, of course, the Chancellor, Wirth, got in touch with the chief of the army thing, whose name I've forgotten, general, and they began seeing what they could perhaps do about it. And as you know, eventually, and we will see in one of the cartoons we're going to look at, under guise of reparations, youth flying corps and things like that, they were developing an Air Force, and they did. And it seems to me that that whole treaty, if they had been a little less harsh in applying it, if not in drawing it up, and a little more strict about carrying out the provisions as pertain to rearmament and that sort of thing, there might not have been a World War II, because it was 1936. Hitler, who didn't have really much of a force at that point, marched what he had over the border into the Rhineland and said, we're taking back the Rhineland, it really belongs to us. And in France, they were all shook up about it. In England, they were all shut up. What shall we do? What shall we do? Eventually, they did nothing. And that started the ball rolling, because Hitler acquired more stature. The Germans were a little happier about, I'm sure you've read about the terrible, terrible inflation in Germany. Wagon loads of bills, of marks, to buy a loaf of bread, that kind of thing. Well, people were truly suffering.
Right.
There was no question about it. So the problem did not go away. During the 1920s, the Ottoman, 3 empires had been taken apart, because you had not only these big units to deal with, but you had, the Ottoman Empire had been turned into the countries in the Near East. Syria and Iraq were the 2 main divisions there that came up, and Iraq was made a dependency of England. It was put in charge of England, supposedly for a certain number of years. Syria was turned over to France, which just meant that they governed it. And we got a brief look at when we talked about Iraq before. This resulted in a restoration of the monarchy, but in England really ruling Iraq. Well, that of course had to come to an end eventually, but these units were there to deal with. And so it was so complicated that how can you see your way through it? Well, not only that, but in Europe, the Russian Empire had collapsed. And it was the Soviet Union they were trying to deal with then, but the Soviet Union was still fighting the White Russians. It still wasn't. But meanwhile, Finland had been split off from it as an independent country. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland was an independent country again, but they carved out a little path through Germany for that, so the Polish could have a port, a seaport. Even in Africa, all the German colonies had turned over to the French and the British, who eagerly accepted them. And for instance, German East Africa became Tanganyika, and the British got the economic gains from that. The whole deal was just so complicated to work with. Well, they began to ease off more and more in applying the treaty in the 30s. And remember Chamberlain and his famous trip, Peace in Our Time. The Germans wanted to march into the Sudetenland and did, and took hold, and well, let's let them have it. After all, they got a hard deal in the war, and they did. Well, what was the effect over here when all this was going on? And it certainly was hitting the newspapers. People were not unaware. Politics was strong in that period. The main voice, as I see it, against the treaties and all this getting in, involving ourselves more in Europe, was Henry Cabot Lodge, in New England senator. And he fought Wilson tooth and nail all the way on that. I think we should perhaps look at now some more pictures. Let's go on. We have picture following that picture of Wilson. Yes. Here's a cartoon, and these are all in American papers. These are American things. You see a wagon with a huge load of reparations on it, 6.6 billion pounds sterling, and the horse that's supposed to carry it is this exhausted, worn out Germany. So the caption is something like, well, maybe if we could just get a foot on the ground or something. That illustrates very graphically what the problem was there. It certainly would have been to our advantage not to demand this money, demand the money perhaps in kind, but to do what Marshall did in World War II, that put in the back. And the Germans and the Japanese had the most peace-loving next generation of anybody on earth. Now the next cartoon we see is another one. This one shows an exhausted Germany sitting there, and that thing, that big flask providing the drink of water is Bolshevism, or communism as it were. Bolshevism used to be called that, and the communist Bolsheviks. And the Germans were truly scared of it. I believe that, because I knew enough of them. And my brother had a college classmate who was a German boy in the 1930s. And after the war, long after, and I was living in Germany, I looked him up. And he had a lovely family who talked to him. He had been in the army. His brother had been in the army at Stalingrad and was lost to Stalingrad in that dreadful episode. And I came from a good family. His father had been an artist, a fairly well-known artist. And he was embarrassed. He was ashamed. He said, we were so afraid of communism, of the Russians rolling in, because it was Germany, that sent Lenin back to Russia. So to some extent I believed that, but it was another factor at any rate that just heated up the pot in Germany and made the German public, I mean, if a decent person like that would be forced into the German army, and I had a distant relative who was, and he was in the logistics, supplies and that sort of thing. And I believe that he was. I no reason not to believe him. But all kinds of just ordinary people were saying, well, in this country too, voting for people they might not otherwise have voted for because they were afraid of other things. Lesser of two evils kind of thing. Well, so the next one here, you see it says reparations on that wall, and the shreds of Treaty of Versailles are peeling off the wall below. And here's this little German in his little tin hat, a little policeman or a little GI or whatever he's supposed to be. He's putting a P in front of the word reparations. It's a clever cartoon, because all of this stuff, as we were just saying, Air Force and getting youth used to marching and following commands and doing all that sort of thing, was well underway. There is Senator Lodge thinly disguised. And Senator Lodge is coming out of a room, see, where there's an operating table where they've worked on the treaty, where they made the treaty without any enemy input at all. And here's, of course, this figure missing limbs and limbs broken and just completely shot, is what he's saying. Okay, here it is. You know,
Yeah.
this is what we'll approve of. So the next one, you see a similar thing. There's Wilson. Here's his treaty. It says League of Nations and his treaty and his peace demands and so on. What is it? Shoot if you must, this old gray head, but spare my country's flag. It's a takeoff on that thing. And of course, there's Senator Lodge coming up with a hatchet to chop it down, very graphically put. And this is a sad one, because the number of deaths, innocent deaths caused by the whole thing. You say, well, yes, but starting the war, the Germans lit the fuse that started the tinderbox, and so they get the blame. But an awful lot of innocent people got it too. These cartoons were published in major newspapers. They were widely read, widely seen, and the American public must have been really in a somewhat of a quandary, because maybe they lost somebody in a ship that was torpedoed by the Germans. Who knows? But the majority, at any rate, was letting Germany just let them suffer. And then, of course, Hitler came along before they had suffered enough, and they suffered some more, but in a different way. And the generation coming up with that, particularly the boys, oh, you know, you're strong, you're good. They did us a bad turn. And the propaganda that got going also,
yes.
There was a strong propaganda story that said the German army did not lose the World War I. We did not lose our German army, our noble fighters. We didn't lose. It was back home, the home front stabbed them in the back. It was known as the stab in the back, you know, propaganda. And it was Jews and Bolsheviks and socialists, all these darn people got in there, crept in, and ruined it. We didn't really lose.
Yeah.
And of course that got going. And I'm sure it didn't really justify it to a lot of Germans, but
No, we always look for a way out.
we always look for a way out.
Not
and
my
the
fault.
young ones, and there was a better way of doing it, as Marshall
Sure.
proved, I think, over and over again with his policy. Morgenthau, Secretary Morgenthau of the Treasury, didn't want to see the United States finances go. Like international banking suffered a great deal, but we were the strong ones.
Yeah.
We came out of the war strong, the First World War strong. And we had the money, and we had, of course, the land that hadn't been trod upon, and our industry was not all shot up or anything. So it's a treaty. We're glad it was there. It did put a formal end, until, of course, we put our formal end to it in 1921 with that a resolution
Right.
that came out of, I think both houses of Congress had to do that.
We need
But
to wind
at the
up
same
now.
time, it really was it was just something that's
It was
just
a
got in there.
many-fingered thing that just didn't fit
It
together.
was, and it got in there and,
Yeah.
and festered. And we didn't be strong where we should have been strong, and we were too strong where we, or I say we, meaning the whole Allied side. But it's a day
Okay.
worth thinking about. It's a lot to think about.
Okay, well, maybe it taught us a lesson.
I hope so.
Okay.